So hey everybody, it's Janelle Stowers. I am back here today to continue our discussion about contracts. We have been discussing all elements of contracts, and today we're going to talk about the discharge of contracts. So we're going to look at a few different instances in which contracts discharge. So please don't think or take the word discharge as being negative, because one of the ways a contract discharges is when it terminates or when it's completely performed. So that means that both parties have done what they are supposed to do under the constraints of the contract, and it has been completely performed. So performance is one way that a contract discharges. Another way that a contract discharges is with a breach of contract. So, of course, we know in this world we live in, there are a million ways that people can breach a contract. But when people don't hold up their end of the deal, it could be the buyer or the seller, then that contract just might be terminated, discharged, or however you want to say it, and a breach of contract may occur. So when we look at a breach of contract, whether it be the buyer or the seller, the buyer could possibly sue for performance, which would mean the courts may force the seller to go ahead and sell the property and for that transfer of title to occur. The buyer could also sue for damages that amount up to the cost of the property, or they could sue for other types of damages. When we start looking at the seller suing the buyer for a default, the seller could certainly sue for a monetary amount, and that monetary amount could be the purchase price of the home or even more. So when we look at the discharge of contracts, again, we're looking at performance, we're looking at the breach of contracts, and then let's look at two other areas. So two other areas I want to look at would be the assignment of contracts and then also novation. Sometimes when individuals are under contracts, or I shouldn't even say individuals, but individuals or entities are under contracts, they might want to assign that contract. That means that whatever they are responsible for or required to do under that contract, they may assign those duties to someone else or some other entity. So someone would be taking over, or they will be assigned the duties of the contract. And then we would look at novation. So novation is not one that we see very often, but novation is simply when you substitute one contract for another. So you may have, I don't know, maybe an era or a term or something that has changed, and you guys just decide to write a completely different contract or write a new contract in an effort to create some newer terms, but you are substituting one contract for the other. That would be considered to be novation. Of course, there are a million other ways that contracts can terminate, but let's look at just a few more before we wrap up. So let's look at partial performance of the terms. So sometimes parties can agree that, hey, you've done as much as you can possibly do. Let's just move on with the contract. So that would be partial performance, and sometimes it might discharge or terminate the situation. Substantial performance can sometimes lead to a discharge when one party has just simply done more than the other party. So that would amount to substantial performance, and it may lead to the discharge or termination of a contract. And then we get to the point of the impossibility of performance. So sometimes extraordinary things may happen, and it may prevent a contract from being fully executed. So let's just think, maybe a house burns down to the ground before the closing date. In that instance, the seller definitely can't perform because the property is no longer there. It would be impossible for them to complete that contract. That would be an instance of the impossibility of performing. Then we would have a mutual agreement. Of course, sometimes parties just decide to walk away. They just mutually agree to end the contract. So we see that more often than the other ones. And then lastly, the very last thing I will mention today is the operation of law. Sometimes contracts simply terminate by the operation of law before they are completed. So maybe there's an eminent domain situation. Maybe the zoning has changed. Maybe the house forecloses. So there can be several instances in which a contract could terminate due to the operation of law. So in essence, if we had to talk about the discharge of contracts, we've looked at several areas. So discharging of a contract doesn't necessarily have to be negative. It could simply be the performance of the contract. We can also have it where parties breach the contract. There can be an assignment of the contract duties. There can be novation, and then a ton of other reasons why contracts can terminate. So thank you guys so much for tuning in today, and that is our discussion on the discharge of contracts. Make sure you go out there, check our videos out, and pass that real estate exam.